chapter 13 is on personality. Now, we use this word personality a lot, like, oh, you have such a good personality, or, your personality is such and such. But I don't know if most people really understand what that term personality means. And so in this chapter, we're going to start off talking about some historical personality researchers such as Freud and Jung and Horney and researchers like that. But then we're going to finish off talking about how psychology has come up with these big 5 personality traits. There are 5 of them, hence the big 5. And most individuals fall into one of these 5 personality traits, or they could have more than one of these. Okay, so with that being said, let's start off with our first module. Module 40, Psychodynamic Approaches to Personality. So there are 3 questions that we're going to answer in this module. The first one is, how do psychologists define and use the concept of personality? The second question, what do the theories of Freud and his successors, those who followed after him, tell us about the structure and development of personality? And then the third question we're going to answer in this module is the psychodynamic approaches to personality. These are approaches that assume that personality is primarily within your unconscious and it's motivated by inner forces and it conflicts about which people have little awareness. So those are the 3 things that we're going to discuss in this module. So let's start off with that first one. And we're going to talk about Freud's psychoanalytic theory, mapping the unconscious mind. So anytime you hear Freud, you think about psychoanalysis, or anytime you hear the word psychoanalysis, you usually think about Freud. At least in psychology, this is what we do, because the 2 of them go hand in hand. So what we mean by the psychoanalytic theory is it is Freud's theory that the unconscious forces act as determinants of your personality. So psychoanalytic theory is truly Freud's theory. He's the one that developed it. And again, it is that unconscious forces act as determinants of personality. Freud truly believed that everything behind our motives and behaviors is controlled by our unconscious. The unconscious is a part of your personality that contains memories, knowledge, beliefs, feelings, urges, drives, and instincts of which the individual is not aware. So that's a whole list of things that occur in the unconscious, and within those, we are not even aware of them. All right, so there are memories, there is knowledge, there are beliefs, there are urges, there are drives, of which we are not even aware of. However, these things do control our behaviors. Some of the unconscious is made up of what is known as the preconscious, and that contains material that is not threatening and is easily brought to mind. So you have the unconscious and then you have the preconscious, and then after the preconscious would be your level of awareness, which would be the conscious. All right, so deeper within your unconscious are these instinctual drives. And what we talk about with instinctual drives or drives themselves are wishes, desires, demands, and especially needs that are hidden from our awareness because of the conflicts and pain which they would cause if they were within our awareness. And so because it could possibly be too painful for us, therefore it is within our unconscious. Now, Freud believed that within structuring our personality, we have 3 levels that control our behavior. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud held that personality consists of 3 separate however, interacting components. So the first one is the id. The id is the instinctual and unorganized part, which sole purpose is to reduce tension created by a primitive drive related to hunger, sex, aggression, and irrational impulses. The id operates on what is known as the pleasure principle. So within the id, Freud believed that what you do is based on bringing you pleasure, right? It's based on the pleasure principle. You want to have pleasure and avoid pain. So behind your behavior is some part of the id in which you are doing what you are doing because it brings you pleasure. The second level after the id is what is known as the ego. The ego is the rational, logical part of ourselves that attempts to balance the desires of the id and the realities of the objective outside world. So just like the id operated on the pleasure principle, the ego operates on the reality principle. So even though you could do something that would bring you pleasure, in reality, that's not allowed. And so you would not actually act on it. The ego is the executive of our personality. Now, after the id and then the ego, we have what is known as the superego. The superego is the part of our personality that harshly judges the morals of our behavior. The superego includes our conscience. It prevents us from behaving in a morally improper way. And it is the superego that makes us feel guilty when we do something wrong. So the ego must constrain and negotiate the conflicts between the superego and the id. Remember, the id is based on the pleasure principle. The superego is our morals. The ego is based on reality. So it is the ego that must, find this balance or do this constant fighting between the id and the superego because they are direct opposites of each other. So this is figure 1 in your textbook, and it's a very well-known figure. This iceberg is what it's referred to as in psychology. Anytime you talk about the id, the ego, and the superego, a lot of times you'll see this diagram or this picture of an iceberg. And it says in Freud's personality model, there are 3 major components: the id, the ego, and the superego. As the iceberg shows, only a small portion of your personality is within the conscious. You can see that id. Remember, the id is the unconscious, and it is based on the pleasure principle. And so a lot of what is behind what we do is actually within our unconscious. Again, according to what Freud thought. Remember, this is Freud's psychoanalytic theory. We have this division between the conscious, what you're aware of, and the unconscious, what you're not aware of. So the ego and the superego are within the conscious. The id is within your unconscious awareness. Now, moving on with Freud, I want to talk about how your personality is developed. And Freud divided these into what he called psychosexual stages. Freud was a big proponent in a lot of what drives our behaviors and our actions has a sexual undertone to it. And so he came up with what are known as the psychosexual stages. And this is the developmental periods that children pass through during which they encounter conflicts between the demands of society and their own sexual urges. And Freud believed that every child goes through this. You have these sexual urges, but it's not appropriate within society. So the first of these stages is the fixations. These are conflicts or concerns that persist beyond the developmental period in which they first occur. And you can read in your textbook examples with all of these psychosexual stages too. Again, in this lecture, I'm just kind of covering, the basics of it. You'll have to do more reading in the textbook as you've had for all of these chapters. So the fixations are the conflicts or concerns that persist beyond the developmental period in which they first occur. You have the oral stage, which according to Freud is a stage from the time you are born until 12 to 18 months of age. And the infant center of pleasure is in the mouth. And this makes sense because feeding is a very big aspect of an infant from the time they are born, right, until they're about a year and a half old. Whether they are breastfeeding, whether they are bottle feeding, but the mouth is that pleasure sensation zone, according to Freud, and that's called the oral stage. He said you then, after 12 to 18 months old, move on to the anal stage. And this is from age 12 to 18 months to around 3 years old. And a child's pleasure center is then on the anus. From age 3, you move on to the phallic stage. So this begins around age 3, and the child's pleasure focuses on the genitals. So you went from the first stage, which was the oral stage, to the anal stage, and now to the phallic stage. And this is where you may have heard about the Oedipus complex. So during this stage, the phallic stage, the child must also negotiate the Oedipal conflict. So a child's intense sexual interest in his or her opposite sex parent. So if it is an infant girl, then it would be the sexual interest in her father. If it is an infant boy, then it would be the sexual interest towards his mother. So for the male child, there is what is called a castration anxiety that leads him to repress his desires for his mother and identify with his father. Excuse me, during this phallic stage. You also have what is known as identification. And this is the process of wanting to be like another person as much as possible. So you imitate that person's behavior and adopt similar beliefs and values. So just like male children had castration anxiety, infant girls also begin to have what is called penis envy and resolve unacceptable feelings by identifying with their mother. So boys have what is called castration anxiety and they identify more with their fathers. Girls have what is called penis envy and they identify more with their mothers. So next we have the latency period, and this is the period between the phallic stage. Remember, the phallic stage started around age 3. So the latency period is from the phallic stage until puberty. Puberty is in girls when they have their first menstrual cycle. So on average, that's around 9 to 11 years old. And in boys, that's from 12 to 14 years old. So it's the period between the phallic stage and puberty in which the children's sexual concerns are temporarily put aside. And then we have the genital stage, and this is from puberty until death. And this is marked by mature sexual behavior that is then sexual intercourse, whenever age that may occur for whichever individual. Now, as you can see, this is figure 2. In your textbook, this is figure 2, and I just have it here on the slides. And it breaks down those 5 stages that Freud said individuals go through. It gives the ages and the major characteristics for these. So this is Freud's theory of personality development that falls into 5 distinct stages.